Hey guys, I wanted to go back and look at some more topics regarding Game of Thrones. For this video, I wanted to make a detailed path of the downfall of David and Dan's career and some of the red flags leading up to Game of Thrones. This will also be a general update as to what happened to them after the show, like with Star Wars and their Netflix deal. Let's start at the beginning and look at some of the red flags. So for D.B. Weiss, he didn't have a lot of experience, and the only notable project he worked on was a potential film adaptation for Halo. He was brought in to write the script, but ultimately the project never got off the ground, so that's not the best sign. Looking at David Benioff, he is the one with more writing experience and has written quite a few movies. Just looking at the blockbuster movies he has written before Game of Thrones, we have Troy and X-Men Origins. Troy is a pretty mixed movie according to fans and critics. The main complaint seems to be that the writing was not good and faithful to the source material, so David Benioff would be to blame for that. And looking at the other movie, X-Men Origins, we have one of the worst Marvel movies in existence. The writing in this movie was so terrible that it made Marvel fans mauled from the sheer dogshit quality of the script. Even the Rotten Tomatoes census roasts David Benioff's writing, stating that X-Men Origins struggles to overcome a cliche-ridden script and a familiar narrative. David Benioff was probably the guy who came up with the idea to sew Deadpool's mouth shut, which is regarded as being one of the most idiotic writing decisions in film history. So good job, Benioff. So for some reason, this is the prime candidate to be one of the showrunners for the biggest TV show in history. By this point, it's 2008 and HBO has already acquired the rights to A Song of Ice and Fire and has hired Benioff and his friend D.B. Weiss to showrun the series. They probably hired him because of his quote-unquote success with Troy. However, since writing original content seems to be their weakness, they won't have to do that for many years until they run out of source material. Pepe laughs, season 7 and 8, oh no, here it comes. So yeah, we fast forward to season 7 and 8, and this is where things obviously start to get worse. Even with a roadmap for the story provided by George R.R. Martin, D&D seemed to still struggle to pull off the writing aspect of the show. Narrative threads seem to have vanished, like Theon Greyjoy's manhood. Practically all the characters deteriorated, especially in dialogue and growth, looking at you, Jon Snow and Tyrion. The plot armor was thicker than Robert Baratheon's waistline, and overall main plot points were not properly built up to and executed. So it became very clear that Dumb and Dumber were not competent writers without source material. And since they probably realized this, they decided to cut the show down and just do a couple shortened seasons. Even though George R.R. Martin and HBO wanted to do like 13 seasons. So in this regard, David and Dan did not want to pass on the show.
You think you can take care of him for me?
Psych!
And this is where it really starts to make my blood boil. Instead of giving the show its proper life cycle by passing it on, Dumb and Dumber acted selfishly and ended the show as fast as possible to move on to bigger projects. They did this because this elevates their status in Hollywood as being the sole creators of the most popular TV series, and they would end up getting crazy offers from Star Wars and Netflix.
We'll never get another chance like this. Our time has finally come.
On top of that, they took the liberty of writing almost every episode in season 7 and 8 to try and validate themselves as being the best and taking more credit. Although it was very clear that they needed help writing the scripts, and HBO even offered to bring in more writers, but D&D just wanted it for themselves. And of course, this inevitably backfired. Hell rained down from the community as everyone realized how bad the writing actually was.
So many questions, man. Cersei ain't supposed to die like that. What? I mean, there's so many questions.
It was so bad that 1.8 million fans signed a petition to remake season 8 with competent writers.
I will not only sign a petition, I will put my face on the front of the daggone pamphlet that y'all taking around.
The backlash got even worse to the point that D&D canceled their scheduled appearance at Comic-Con in 2019. Freaking cowards, man.
I know we're following the Game of Thrones panel, which is a fucking nightmare, just objectively. I also know that their showrunners didn't show up because they didn't want to answer questions about the show. So,
After a couple months, they went to the Austin Film Festival, and there they talked more about their time at Game of Thrones. And the main revelation was that D&D heavily downplayed the fantasy element of the show.
You know, we tried to keep that stuff to a minimum because we didn't just want it to appeal to a fantasy fan base. We wanted them to love it, and we wanted parents to love it and people who played professional football to love it.
And they never really sat down to try and boil down all the book's essential elements, as they found the scope to be too big. And to me, this is one of the most annoying revelations. Dumb and Dumber actively cut down and oversimplified the show to make things easier. A prime example of this is Bran. In Season 6, we find out that he can interact with the past and can warg into anything. But what do they do with this in Season 8? Nothing. He just wargs into some crows. So by decreasing the scope and fantasy elements of the show, Dumb and Dumber tried to simplify the writing to make their jobs easier, and by doing so, they ruined the final seasons of Game of Thrones. Towards the end of the run in 2017, Dumb and Dumber were pitching their original series to HBO called Confederate. The premise is that the Civil War ended in a stalemate and slavery is still around. That terrible premise is pretty much the equivalent of a third grader asking a what-if question to their history teacher. These two knuckleheads thought it would make for a good TV drama if we lived in an alternate universe where slaves were still around. Yikes. Obviously, HBO did not want to produce the show, and David and Dan received a lot of backlash on Twitter for it. People said that it was basically slave fanfiction and that it just sounded like a terrible idea. After this whole series pitch, they were approached to do a trilogy for Star Wars in February 2018. This is also where things kind of get depressing, because Disney was probably in talks with Dumb and Dumber before 2018, and this whole development probably led them to the decision to rush Game of Thrones to its end. Especially since they've been expressing that they've been worn out by the show.
Well, it's very hard to work on something for 364 and a half days a year for 10 years without feeling like it's your own.
So for the Star Wars deal, they were supposed to come up with an original trilogy, which to be honest at this point I wanted to see how bad it was going to be, but it didn't end up coming to fruition. Overall, there's not much detail as to what happened besides D&D backing out of the Star Wars deal and taking a $200 million contract with Netflix. Through the timeline of the end of Game of Thrones and the Netflix deal, Dumb and Dumber had about a year to pitch and write a trilogy for Star Wars. A whole year. So this makes you think that they utterly failed to come up with a good script or idea. It's also funny because in Game of Thrones they complained about the scope of the series being too big, but Star Wars also has a massive scope with tons of lore and rules to follow within its universe. That, and it didn't seem like they were taking this dream job opportunity very seriously given that David Benioff had the main writing credit in Gemini Man. And surprise surprise, the main complaint about the movie was the writing. So while these degenerates were struggling to come up with a trilogy for Star Wars, they took the easy way out and ditched their contract with Disney and took a multi-year film and TV deal with Netflix. And you'd have to be pretty bad at writing to pass up on an opportunity to write movies for Star Wars. So going into the Netflix deal, this is where things get even more interesting about their downfall. It's been a whole year now that David and Dan have been working at Netflix. And what have they done? They directed one comedy special with Leslie Jones in January 2020, which to me is hilarious. The top showrunners in Hollywood go from Game of Thrones to a Leslie Jones comedy special.
Oh my God!
It seems like Netflix at the time had no idea what to do with Dumb and Dumber. Probably because they were pitching terrible ideas for shows and movies on the level of Confederate. Although this is mostly speculation, but like, what else have they been doing at Netflix for the past year? They could have been doing nothing else besides pitching shows and movies to Netflix, and they have probably been denying all of them because of how bad the writing is.
Why do you think I came all this way?
So until recently, we found out that David and Dan, along with Alexander Wu, will be the showrunners for a new series that will be a book adaptation for the Three-Body Problem. Which this whole scenario is pretty ironic because D&D ended up getting thrown back into a book adaptation when they had the opportunity to do whatever they wanted. I think Netflix finally realized what these two buffoons are good at, making book adaptations. But yeah, this is basically where David and Dan are at currently. They just now announced this new series and it's probably just starting pre-production. It's just crazy how these two guys go from being the top creators in Hollywood to then getting the opportunity to do a Star Wars trilogy and then ending up doing nothing for Netflix for a whole year. I'm sure Netflix at this point is regarding making a $200 million deal with these two morons, and now Dumb and Dumber are back to making adaptions.